Hey guys and girls, in this video I'm going to introduce you to a library called FluidTest, which is a test library that helps you with end-to-end testing of complex architectures and complex scenarios that you're going to often find in your career. The motivation behind this library was to try and fill a lot of the gaps. So I've been working for a few years now with Azure, and I've been doing some very complex architectures. And now we're in a low-code world, we really need a way to be able to test our system end to end. Traditionally, we'd write a lot of unit tests, but now that we're writing less code, we need actually a way to validate that our architecture works and it works end to end. So if you're looking for something that helps you test your system end to end, and you want to make sure that the configuration and everything's happening as it should, you definitely want to take a look at this library because it does cater for a number of scenarios. I've got everything documented here in the NuGet repository, so sorry, in the GitHub repository, so you can have a read through. There are some examples, but what I'm going to do today is just take you through how you get it set up on your local project and how it can help you, and I'll give you a hello world example as well. So I'll just sort of show you how it keeps your tests really clean, really focused, and it allows you to chain together very complex business scenarios. Okay, so I do encourage you to read the README and go over the examples and just try to get a grasp of what this is trying to achieve. But what we'll do now, we'll quickly skip to Visual Studio, and what I've done, I've created a very simple test, and what this test is doing, it's kind of doing a direct translation to what you would do in a unit test, where you do, you know, your AAAs, your arrange, act, and assert. And so the first thing we need to do, we need to actually install the FluidTest engine. To do that, you can just go to Manage NuGet Packages. I've already got it installed, but you know, you can browse for it, search for FluidTest. You do want the one called FluidTest. There are some extra libraries that you're going to see here. These are extensions to FluidTest, but the core engine is just called FluidTest, and that's the one that I'm going to show you today. As you can see, we've got some very complex scenarios for things like Azure Synapse, Cosmos DB, Azure Storage, and Azure Search. These are bindings, these are extensions to the core framework. So how this works is, as we work on more and more Azure components, you will see that each one will have a library. So an example would be, if we're doing something with logic apps, you'll expect in the future to find fluidtest.logicapps as an example. So watch this space, because this area is growing quite rapidly. Okay, so let's go back to our test. So what we've got, we're using, it's just a standard MS test unit test project. And what we've got here is a very simple initialize statement. And what we're doing is we're essentially initializing a record service. And what we're saying is, we're saying that today, we're working with some strings. Okay, our primary identifier is a string, and what you can actually do when you instantiate this, you can supply something known as the aggregate ID. Now, the aggregate ID you can think of is like, you can think of it as your root level identifier. So an example would be an order. An order has an ID, and underneath it you can have order lines, and each line could have its own ID. But the idea with this framework is to actually have this composition root where you deal with aggregates. So you always care about the hierarchy and the parent object. What you can then do is you can actually start to basically pass this ID down, and you can propagate it to its children. And what's nice is that you end up with tests that look very focused like this. You can chain complex business scenarios together. You can do things almost on the fly. So let's have a little look at what this test is doing. In this scenario, what I'm doing is, before I do anything, I'm running something called a pre-execution action. And what that does, let's just have a look at this. This is just sample code, but the idea is to get you started. The idea here is that it's going to pass us the aggregate ID, and the aggregate ID was created here. So it's a GUID, new GUID, okay? And what it's going to do is actually going to go and create us a local file path. So see here, I've got cdemo fluid test, and it's going to create a file. The idea is what it's going to do, it's going to create a file with this path, and the text inside it is going to say creating initial file. So that's cool. So that's essentially what it's going to do here. It's going to create a file that looks something like this. Okay, so I just make that a bit bigger. These are ones I left here earlier, so you can have a look. But yeah, it's going to create a blank file, okay, or a blank file, and then it's going to essentially add some text to it. So let's put a breakpoint on here. Let's just clear out our folder, and I'll show. We'll build this up as we go, so you get the idea. So let's debug. Okay, and we'll see that our aggregate ID is, yeah, so DC, that's what was just generated by us when we created a new GUID. Now what you should see is, there you go, there's your GUID DC. If I open this file, cool, yep, it's got the initial text, create an initial file. Now you could imagine in a real world scenario that you'd be doing something much more complex here. What you'd be doing is you'd be perhaps setting up your test data in your database. So you'd be arranging your data so it's ready to be processed. Here I'm just showing you how the engine works. Okay, so this doesn't do much. This just creates a file, puts some text in there. Okay, so that's cool. We can carry on with that. So I'll let this run to the end, because what it does, it'll actually go and clean up the data. It'll actually, at the end, I'll show you how this works. It should go and, yeah, clean up the file. Perfect. Okay, so far simple. What we've done is we've created a initial file. Now what we're going to do is we're going to pass in. So every time we initiate the record service, you have a method which allows you at any stage or any point to get the aggregate ID. And in our case, as you remember, it's just a GUID. We're making it up on the fly for demo purposes. In your world, it might be, you know, a value that comes from a database or something that you control. So what we're now going to do, we're going to create a record, okay? And what this will do, let's just go in here. So we're going to basically pass it the aggregate ID. And as we come in here, what this will do, it'll pass in the aggregate ID. And what we'll do is we'll just make a link to the file again. So, you know, nothing magic. What we're going to do here, we're going to actually return something called a record. And a record is basically every time you do something in this engine, it tracks your history. It will collect all the IDs and all the objects that were created in your test session. And the reason we do that is so that at the end, when you do your cleanup, it knows how to leave the system in the state that it found it. And that's really important with integration testing or end-to-end testing. The best practice is to always leave the system in the state that you found it. So what we're going to do, we're going to wait 5 seconds. This gives you time to see the file before it gets deleted. This sleep doesn't really give us any functional value. It just gives us time to look at it being deleted. Then what we're going to do this time, we're going to do something a bit more interesting. We're going to now get the aggregate ID that's, you know, that we inject in the constructor, and we're just going to write it to a text file. Then what we're going to do is return a new record. We're saying that it's of type string, you know, and so the object type is a string and the ID type is a string. You know, you can imagine this could be a complex object. It could be an order. It could be, I don't know, you could think of any sort of domain object. And what we do is we actually pass a handler. This is an optional handler to clean up. And what this will do, it says at the end of the test run, I want you to go and delete the file. Yeah, because we don't want to leave a mess in our system, and we don't want to leave a mess in our database if you're using a database or if you're using an API. So the best practice, as I mentioned earlier, is to always have a cleanup handler, and that will do the job for you. Okay. Now, so that's that step. So let's just go back to the test. What we're then going to do, this is really where the magic of the engine happens. It will automatically, when you create a related record, okay, so we've got the ID, we've got the parent ID. What it will now do is it will create a related record, and what FluidTest will do is it'll actually pass the aggregate ID into this class for you. So let me show you what this looks like. if we go to the definition, notice that it passes the aggregate ID. I didn't have to do anything. This is just how the engine works. When you implement the interface that it tells you to, it basically, it will, under the hood, it will just say, okay, go and pass me the aggregate ID. And look, I can then use this aggregate ID to append the text file. So what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to write to the text file and say related record was passed in aggregate ID with value and the aggregate ID. And we'll have a look at this. This is quite powerful. The benefit of this approach is it allows you to write classes that are reusable, and you don't have tests where you're always having to maintain the state of the IDs. You let the engine do that, you let the engine handle that for you. So that's why it's done in this way. Okay, let's go back to the test. Then what we're finally going to do, the final step, is we're going to do an assertion. So every good test has an assert, and what this will do is essentially this will go and we pass in the aggregate ID again, okay, and then what it does, it says it forces you to override a method called get record. And what this does, this says, how do I get the record out? So I know my aggregate ID. I now want to go and have a look at what's happened for that ID, and I want to go and return the contents. Now, in our scenario, we were dealing with a file, so it's very simple. We're just going to go and read the file contents. And what we're then going to do is we've got this list of validators, and they're very simple ones. They're just to prove the point. We're first of all saying the file must contain the aggregate ID. So when we actually read the file, we're saying we're looking for that GUID text somewhere inside the file. And we're also checking that the file exists, okay? And let's just have a look at this. That's very simple. We're just saying item. So the item will get passed in for you, no magic. You see, it's all done by the engine. And we're saying that the item text must contain the aggregate ID. Okay, and that's all that's doing. Then what it does, it says check the file exists. Here it does the same. It passes in the aggregate ID and checks the files exists. Okay, then at the end, the final step is to actually perform the cleanup, and the cleanup has there's two options here. If you call cleanup with no parameter, it will actually use the handlers that I showed you here. So it will actually go and run these ones, okay? If you want to supply your own cleanup method and you want to do some custom cleanup, you can also do that. So you could create a class here and you could say new cleanup method. I don't know, let's just make it fun. And what we'll do, we'll quickly create one. Let's just quickly create one. We're going to implement iRecord cleanup. And all it's going to do, you see what it will do here, if you do a custom cleanup, it will actually pass you all the objects and records that were created in your session. It'll also pass you the aggregate ID because that may help, avoid you having to loop for all of these. It gives you this to help more than anything. And here you can write your custom logic. So custom logic to delete stroke cleanup. An example would be delete from table 1 where session ID equals aggregate ID. You get the idea, something like that. Yeah, we're not going to do that in this scenario. We're going to use the localized handler. So we're just going to run the cleanup as it is. Now let's run this test very quickly. What I'm going to quickly do is bring this up to the side. I'm just going to run this test, and what we'll see, a file gets created. We're going to quickly have a look at it. Okay, you see what happened there? It actually cleaned it up. So let's just run it again, because I'm always cleaning it up at the end. And now if we edit, yeah, it's too fast for me. It's too fast. What we'll do, to just show you how this works, what we'll do, we'll actually put a breakpoint here. We'll debug it. We'll wait for our breakpoint to be hit. Let's just take out these breakpoints. Let's just take these breakpoints out. Here we go. So now we've got our file content, and let's have a look at what happened. So we created the initial file. This is our pre-execution handler. Then we created the file and we passed in the aggregate ID. Then we created a related record, and look, oh, this is the key bit here. Look at the ID. So it's in the child record, so the related record, it passed it in for us. How handy is that? It kept the test nice and clean. We're not having to maintain the state of our IDs. It also leaves us into a nice place where every class that we write follows the single responsibility. Each class only does one thing. Each class only does one thing that it's designed to do. And that allows you to reuse these classes in other test scenarios or other test cases. Most importantly, if we go back to our test, we get a very readable test. There is no state maintained in here, so you're not having to worry about IDs. It's very clean and it's very easy to learn. All of your tests will follow the same structure. So onboarding new members of staff or training somebody else should be much easier because you're only having to use 7 or 8 different methods and you're following a convention that is very straightforward. At the same time, you're also keeping your code production grade. So you're keeping it professional, you're keeping it, you're almost treating it like an artifact. It's treated with the same respect as your production code. So that's really what I wanted to show you in this video. But you can really do some powerful things with these. I've used this to test things like logic apps, event-based systems. An example I recently worked on was I had a data lake, and what happened was every time a file arrived in that data lake, it actually kicked off an Azure Synapse pipeline, and I was able to automate all of that process using this library. There was no code written in terms of Synapse and Data Lake, because that was all done by Microsoft. It was done by Azure, drag and drop and GUI. But actually, how you test that, you need something like FluidTest, or you need an approach that is reliable. And in later videos, I'll show you that. I'll take you through those examples and how you'd get set up. And we can actually look at some of the NuGet packages that are being released that extend the core functionality. So I mentioned earlier, so if I quickly show you this, if I just type in FluidTest here, I mentioned that there's one for Cosmos DB, or there's one for Azure Search, or for Azure Storage. Now, what these are essentially bindings. They are iRecord creators, so they are things like this. They're ready-made record creators, so they follow these interfaces, and it will give you some out-of-the-box custom bindings, that you can start using straight away on your projects. So that's all for this video. I hope you found it useful, and yeah, any questions, feel free to subscribe and contact me. Thank you.